been a bit of a shock. However much one tries to prepare oneself for something like this, it's still a dreadful shock, and we're still trying to come to terms with that. And it's
Balmoral had survived deaths, scandals, and bitter family divisions, but nothing prepared its walls for the document Prince Edward placed on the polished table that morning. With one controlled signature, Camilla was removed from the private wing she believed was permanently hers. The rooms were transferred to Princess Anne, the keys were recalled, and before the Queen could challenge the decision, the order had already begun moving through the estate. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Edward entered the closed estate meeting carrying a dark folder. He dismissed 2 aides, read the final paragraph twice, and signed without hesitation. The Balmoral Estate Order, an internal document controlling who may occupy and manage parts of the royal residence, removed Camilla's right to the private East Wing and transferred its rooms, staff access, ceremonial privileges, and authority to Anne. When he set the pen down, no one spoke. The private wing meant far more than bedrooms. It represented trust, seniority, and personal acceptance inside the family, privileges settled through private agreement. Losing it told Camilla that her place within the estate could still be questioned. Gaining it placed Anne inside a conflict she had never asked to inherit. Camilla was preparing correspondence when the order reached her sitting room. She slowed at the instruction, ordering her possessions removed before the Princess Royal arrived. The Princess Royal is the lifelong title traditionally granted to the monarch's eldest daughter. Her expression hardened. She reopened the page and demanded to know who had authorized it. Anne felt no triumph when Edward placed the keys in her hand. She looked at her brother and asked whether Charles had approved. He said only that the decision had become necessary. The answer suggested the king had been informed after the signature, not before it. The sealed appendix changed everything. An appendix is an attached section containing supporting details, and this one was barred from Camilla. It referred to restricted rooms, private papers, and an instruction that had been ignored. Charles received the file only after the removal had begun, proving Edward had acted under authority that did not depend entirely on the monarch's immediate consent. Camilla did not summon him. Instead, she requested an audience with Anne. The choice revealed where she believed the true wound lay. This was no longer a dispute over rooms. It was a reckoning between 2 women, divided by memory, loyalty, and rank. But before Camilla could challenge the signature, she had to face the woman now holding the keys. And the history between them was far more dangerous than the document itself. The order may have carried Edward's signature, but its emotional weight fell upon 3 people whose loyalties had been tested for decades. Camilla saw humiliation. Anne saw an unwanted responsibility. Edward saw a duty no one else had been willing to perform. Behind them stood Charles, caught between his wife, his siblings, and the painful possibility that protecting one relationship had quietly endangered the unity of the crown. Edward had always been the quiet brother, the one people underestimated because he rarely pushed himself toward the center of royal conflict. He had built his place through restraint, patience, and service rather than confrontation. That made his decision far more alarming. When a man known for avoiding unnecessary battles finally chose to act, no one could dismiss the order as a moment of anger. Anne understood that immediately. Balmoral was not simply a royal home to her. It carried memories of discipline, family duty, and loyalty to the late queen, and that history made control of its private wing feel more like a burden than a reward. Edward met his sister beside an unlit fireplace, away from staff and advisors. He placed the keys between them, but Anne did not reach for them. She looked at him with quiet unease and asked whether accepting them would fracture the family beyond repair. The internal stewardship arrangement, an estate system giving selected royals limited authority over access and household responsibilities, had given him a narrow, but legitimate path to transfer the wing. Yet legality could not soften what the act meant emotionally. He told her the decision was necessary. She asked whether it was also unforgivable. He did not answer. Camilla felt the meaning before anyone explained it. The removal was private on paper, but to her it felt like a public demotion waiting to be discovered. She feared the decision proved she was still tolerated rather than trusted, still accepted by title, but held at a distance by blood. Charles read the order alone and felt that fear spreading through every line. He removed his glasses, pressed his fingers against his eyes, and remained silent when an equerry, a royal household official who assists senior family members, asked whether the transfer should be paused. The king's silence was not approval, but it was not resistance either. Anne had already warned Camilla months earlier not to treat the Balmoral wing as personal property. She now repeated that warning to Edward through a documented account she had written after their exchange. Camilla's response had been cold and unforgettable. Rank, she had said, carried its own rights. The statement had stayed with both siblings because it suggested the dispute was no longer about rooms. It was about authority. The sealed appendix pointed toward the moment when Edward finally stopped believing silence could protect the monarchy. It named one private Balmoral gathering, one closed door, and one file that should never have moved. To understand why Edward finally acted, the family would have to return to the night when a closed door, a missing file, and one defiant conversation changed everything. The transfer did not begin with a property dispute. It began months earlier, during a private gathering at Balmoral, when Camilla entered a restricted study after being explicitly told it would remain sealed. What happened inside lasted less than 20 minutes, but it shattered Edward's confidence, provoked Anne's fury, and left one sensitive file out of place. From that night onward, the East Wing was no longer merely a residence. It had become evidence. Camilla left the drawing room during the autumn dinner without explaining where she was going. She dismissed a footman near the corridor and continued toward the study adjoining the private wing. Earlier that evening, Anne had told her plainly that no one could enter until the inventory was complete. The inventory was a formal record of every document and object stored in the room, designed to ensure that nothing was removed, altered, or misplaced. Edward had confirmed the access restrictions himself before the gathering, making the warning impossible to misunderstand. Anne noticed the absence first. She followed the corridor, found the study door open, and stopped when she saw Camilla standing beside the desk, with a blue file in her hands. No aides were present. No staff remained close enough to interrupt them. The Princess Royal demanded that she put it down. Camilla closed the folder slowly and asked who had given her authority to issue commands to the Queen. Anne felt the insult strike deeper than rank. The room held family correspondence, estate instructions, and private papers protected under rules established during the late Queen's reign. Those materials mattered because they contained personal decisions never intended for casual access, while the restrictions preserved trust among relatives already divided by suspicion. She told Camilla that the rule applied to everyone. The Queen Consort replied that she should not be excluded from rooms or records inside a royal residence, and she refused to apologize for entering. Edward arrived after the confrontation had ended, but the silence inside the study told him enough. He examined the blue file, checked each paper against the inventory, and discovered that one estate memorandum had been moved into another folder. A memorandum is a written internal note used to record instructions or decisions. Nothing had disappeared, yet the disturbance proved that the boundary had been knowingly crossed. Anne later gave him a documented account of the exchange, including the exact words spoken beside the desk. Charles asked his brother to contain the incident before it became a family crisis. The king feared that exposing the breach would turn a private mistake into a public humiliation for his wife. Edward agreed, but he recorded every detail and preserved his sister's warning that the boundary would be crossed again. Weeks later, a second access request reached him, bearing Camilla's handwritten amendment. She had expanded her own permission without consulting Anne. Edward read the altered line twice, remembered the open door and displaced file, and understood that silence was no longer protecting the monarchy. The hidden breach had created the reason, but the next confrontation would determine whether Camilla surrendered the wing quietly or forced Edward to defend his decision face to face. Camilla did not plead when she entered the private morning room. She closed the door herself, placed Edward's order on the table and demanded that he withdraw it before the household learned what he had done. Edward remained standing. Anne waited by the window, refusing to leave. For the first time, all three faced the truth without aids, ceremony, or carefully prepared language. And the argument that followed exposed wounds much older than Balmoral. Camilla had expected a private meeting with Edward, one in which pressure could still reverse the transfer before Anne formally took possession. Instead, he had asked his sister to attend, because the order gave her direct responsibility, and because he refused to let the dispute become two conflicting private stories later. The signed order was an internal estate instruction, meaning a formal household decision controlling access, rooms, and responsibilities within Balmoral. She pushed it across the table. "You had no right to remove me from rooms assigned to the king and queen." He returned it without sitting. "They were assigned for use, not surrendered as personal territory." Anne moved a chair aside when Camilla accused her of engineering the humiliation out of resentment. She stepped closer, but her voice stayed controlled. The Princess Royal, a title traditionally given to the monarch's eldest daughter, said she had wanted the rules respected, not the rooms. Camilla answered that the distinction meant nothing now. To her, the transfer was not administration. It was a declaration that even as queen, she could still be overruled by people who had never fully accepted her. Edward let the silence tighten before admitting that Charles had asked him months earlier to contain the original study incident. Camilla's anger changed instantly. She stared at him, then at Anne, realizing her husband had known a written record existed. He explained that the sealed appendix documented 3 breaches: entry into the restricted study, the altered access request, and an instruction to staff that directly contradicted his sister's authority. The appendix was a protected attachment containing evidence too sensitive for general circulation, and every page had been preserved. Camilla threatened to appeal directly to Charles. Anne did not flinch. She told her that the king had already received the file and had not ordered Edward to stop. That answer landed harder than any accusation, because it meant the monarch's silence was no longer neutral. He had seen the evidence. He had allowed the transfer to continue. Camilla opened her handbag and removed the wing key. She placed it on the table, but kept 2 fingers pressed against it. Looking at Anne, she asked whether victory felt worth the damage. Her rival answered that there was no victory in forcing a family to obey boundaries it should never have crossed. A knock broke the confrontation. Charles wanted Edward immediately. The summons carried no explanation, only urgency. He took the key, left the 2 women facing each other, and understood that everything could still be undone. Camilla had surrendered the key but not the fight, and everything now depended on whether Charles would defend his wife or uphold the authority Edward had dared to use. Edward entered Charles's study expecting anger, perhaps even a command to destroy the order. Instead, the king stood beside the desk, with the sealed appendix open before him. The brothers spoke without advisors. One had acted to preserve the rules, the other had spent months trying to preserve peace. Yet peace had become its own danger, and Charles now faced a brutal choice between shielding Camilla from humiliation and admitting that Edward's decision was justified. Charles read the account of the study confrontation again and stopped at Anne's written statement. His hand tightened around the page when he reached the moment Camilla had invoked her position as queen to dismiss the restriction. The internal estate stewardship arrangement was a limited household system that allowed an appointed royal to act when protected materials, access rules, or estate boundaries were compromised. It did not place Edward above his brother. It allowed him to make immediate operational decisions unless the monarch formally overruled them. Edward remained near the door until Charles asked why he had not come sooner. He answered that he had delayed once out of loyalty after the king requested silence over the original breach. He would not delay again. Staff were now receiving conflicting instructions from Camilla and Anne, and every contradiction weakened the authority of the household. Balmoral mattered because it was supposed to remain a private refuge, not a place where rank could override rules. The preserved papers mattered because family trust would collapse if anyone could enter, amend access, or direct staff without consequence. Charles felt the accusation, even though his brother never raised his voice. He had tried to protect his wife from shame, but reversing the transfer now would send a darker message. Closeness to the monarch carried more power than established boundaries. The king set the appendix down and admitted that the situation felt like a personal betrayal. Edward replied that he feared losing his brother's trust, yet he could no longer protect that trust by ignoring the facts. Charles looked at him for a long moment. The deeper loss, he said, would come from demanding silence when silence is no longer justified. Then he pulled a single-page acknowledgement toward him. An acknowledgement was a written confirmation that the monarch had reviewed and accepted an internal decision. He signed it, confirming that Anne would assume control of the wing under Edward's transfer. Edward did not celebrate. He watched his brother add one condition in his own hand. Camilla must be allowed to remove her possessions privately, with dignity, and without press access. The Queen would lose authority over the rooms, but she would not be publicly paraded through humiliation. Charles handed back the paper and asked whether Anne understood the full extent of what she was inheriting. Edward hesitated. That pause told the king the transfer involved more than bedrooms, keys, or staff. It carried control over protected spaces, family access, and rules linked directly to the late Queen's final arrangements. Charles had allowed the order to stand, but as Camilla began packing, the true scale of Anne's new control and the cost of Camilla's removal started to emerge. By the following morning, the East Wing no longer answered to Camilla. Staff lists were revised, locks were scheduled for replacement, and boxes appeared outside rooms she had once entered without question. Yet the most painful moment came without ceremony. Standing alone beside a half-empty writing desk, Camilla discovered that the transfer had stripped away more than accommodation. It had removed her private influence over one of the monarchy's most emotionally sacred spaces. Camilla watched an attendant wrap the framed photograph she had placed on the mantel months earlier. She stopped the packing, took the frame into her own hands, and dismissed the woman with a quiet nod. The immediate consequences were already unmistakable. Her dedicated rooms had been closed, her personal staffing arrangements were ending, and any future entrance into the wing would require Anne's approval. That control mattered because the rooms were tied to private family gatherings, while access itself had long signaled who was trusted inside Balmoral's most intimate circle. A senior housekeeper entered carrying a bundle of letters and asked where the Queen's correspondence should be sent. The housekeeper was the senior member of domestic staff responsible for managing rooms and household arrangements. Camilla answered, "Not here," then looked toward the closed study door that had triggered the crisis. The East Wing also controlled guest allocations, entry to the adjoining archive corridor, and several family spaces used during private stays. Losing those powers meant she was not simply changing rooms. She was surrendering influence over who entered, who stayed, and which traditions shaped life inside the estate. Charles arrived without staff and closed the door behind him. Camilla did not turn when he explained that supporting Edward's transfer was not a rejection of their marriage. The king said he had protected her dignity by demanding a private removal and keeping the original breach from the press. She answered that the distinction would mean little once the household understood what had happened. His silence had allowed Anne's judgment to stand, and to her, that felt like abandonment wearing the language of duty. Charles reached for the photograph, but Camilla held it closer. He admitted that reversing the order would have told every member of staff that her wishes mattered more than the rules. She replied that he had preserved the institution by letting his wife carry the humiliation. Neither raised a voice. That restraint made the distance between them feel even colder. Anne entered the wing only after Camilla had left. She examined the transfer and discovered that it granted her power to restore the late Queen's original room use protocols. Formal rules governing who could occupy, enter, or manage protected spaces. Camilla had gradually relaxed those restrictions, but the Princess Royal could now reinstate every one of them. An attendant then found an unopened box marked with Edward's name and an instruction that it be delivered only after the departure. Anne carried it to her brother personally. He saw the label, asked her to close the door, and warned that what lay inside would change the meaning of the transfer completely. Camilla's rooms were emptying, but inside Edward's sealed box lay the final intention behind the decision, and it would transform Anne's understanding of everything she had accepted. Anne expected the box to contain another record of Camilla's mistakes. Instead, she found a handwritten instruction concerning Balmoral's future and her own place within it. Edward had not transferred the wing merely to remove someone. He had chosen Anne because the family needed a guardian who would not confuse possession with service. Alone together, stripped of protocol, the siblings confronted the uncomfortable truth. The order was never meant to humiliate Camilla. It was meant to restore a boundary. Anne unfolded the private stewardship note and read it without speaking. A stewardship note was a personal written instruction explaining how royal property should be protected and managed for the family, rather than treated as an individual possession. Edward told her it had been prepared during the final period of the late Queen's reign, when concern had grown that Balmoral's intimate spaces could slowly become symbols of private control. The instruction did not name his sister or assign her the wing. It set out principles instead: protect access, resist entitlement, preserve sensitive records, and keep the estate a shared refuge. Anne read the note a second time before placing it between them. She and Edward sat alone at a small table, with no aides, secretaries, or household officials to soften what needed to be said. She asked why he had placed such a burden upon her without first seeking her consent. The Princess Royal understood why Balmoral mattered. It held the family's private memories, while its protected rooms preserved trust that public titles could never replace. Yet she also understood what accepting control would cost her relationship with Camilla. Edward admitted the truth. He feared Anne would refuse if she knew how personally Camilla would take the transfer. He had used her sense of duty because he believed no one else would hold the boundary once pressure began. His sister felt the manipulation immediately. She told him that service did not give him permission to decide her sacrifices for her. Still, she could hear the urgency beneath his confession. He had watched silence fail once and refused to let it fail again. Anne made her position clear. She did not want Camilla exiled, publicly diminished, or excluded from family life. She wanted the rules restored before Balmoral became another battlefield where old resentment controlled every room. The Queen Consort would retain access to the main castle and continue attending family gatherings, but she would no longer control the private wing or its adjoining records. Edward listened as his sister demanded one final change: the implementation order, a document explaining how an approved decision must be carried out, would describe the transfer internally as a restoration of stewardship, not a personal punishment. He amended the wording while she watched, then pushed the page toward her. Anne signed it and slid it back. "Then we finish this properly." Edward finally released the breath he had been holding. Their agreement reached Charles through the revised documented order, just as news arrived that photographers had noticed Camilla's belongings leaving Balmoral. The king understood at once that the private balance they had created was about to be judged by people who knew none of the truth. Anne had found the balance the family could live with, but beyond Balmoral's gates, one photograph and a single front page were about to tell the country a far harsher story. The palace intended the transfer to remain private, but secrecy collapsed when a removal vehicle left Balmoral, carrying boxes marked for another royal residence. By sunrise, the country was staring at a story the household could no longer contain. The image was simple and devastating: Camilla's belongings leaving the estate, while Anne's car passed through the gates. To the public, it looked less like an administrative change and more like a royal judgment. Photographers captured the labeled containers first. Less than an hour later, they recorded Anne arriving with Edward beside her, and the timing made every official explanation appear fragile. Palace communications described the changes as a routine reorganization, meaning an internal adjustment to rooms, staffing, and household responsibilities. Yet the statement never denied that Camilla had lost the East Wing. That omission mattered, because royal language is often judged by what it refuses to say, and silence now sounded like confirmation. The public verdict arrived before breakfast. A major newspaper placed the removal vehicle across its front page, beneath the headline, "Anne gets the keys." Beside it appeared a smaller photograph of Camilla leaving church with a fixed expression. The contrast was ruthless. One woman appeared to be entering power, while the other seemed to be carrying the weight of rejection. By evening, a royal correspondent described the decision during a recorded broadcast as the clearest internal rebuke Camilla has faced since becoming queen. The phrase transformed a private dispute into a national argument about trust, privilege, and accountability. Camilla watched the coverage with the sound muted. She sat motionless until Charles entered, then switched off the television before he could hear the commentary. The Queen asked whether the palace intended to defend her. The King answered that they would defend her dignity, but they would not deny the decision. She looked away because his distinction felt painfully familiar. He would protect her from cruelty, but he would not restore what she had lost. Anne rejected the triumph being forced upon her. She instructed staff not to celebrate, discuss the transfer, or answer questions from anyone outside the household. The Princess Royal knew that controlling the wing carried responsibility, not victory, and she refused to let Camilla's humiliation become proof of her own success. Edward supported that position by authorizing a limited palace statement confirming that his sister had assumed stewardship, the duty of protecting and managing a royal space on behalf of the family. The statement ended speculation, but concealed the deepest truth. It made no reference to the restricted study, the altered access request, or the instruction that had contradicted Anne's authority. Edward deliberately protected Camilla's privacy, even as the country judged her without knowing why the transfer had happened. Charles gathered the family at Balmoral after the confirmation. One task remained. Camilla and Anne had to decide whether the boundary would permanently divide them or finally end the struggle neither woman could afford to continue. The nation had already delivered its judgment, but the monarchy's true verdict would be written behind closed doors when Anne returned Camilla's final personal possession. The final exchange occurred without cameras, advisors, or raised voices. Anne entered Camilla's new sitting room carrying a small wooden case left behind at Balmoral. Inside was not a state document or disputed key, but a personal brooch Camilla believed she had lost. In returning it herself, Anne offered neither surrender nor apology. She offered something more difficult: dignity without retreat, compassion without reversing the decision, and a path forward built upon boundaries both women could finally understand. Anne placed the case in front of Camilla and explained that the brooch had been discovered behind the writing desk during the final inspection. She could have sent it through staff, but she had chosen to deliver it herself. The Queen opened the lid and recognized the piece immediately. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Stewardship, the responsibility of protecting royal property and traditions for the family, rather than claiming them personally, now belonged permanently to the Princess Royal. She would control the East Wing, its staff access, archive corridor, protected rooms, and guest arrangements. Camilla remained queen and would continue attending family gatherings at Balmoral, but she no longer possessed automatic authority over the transferred spaces. That distinction mattered because it preserved her place in the family while ending the belief that rank could erase every boundary. She closed the wooden case and admitted that entering the restricted study had been driven by anger. Feeling excluded had made her believe she was entitled to challenge the rule. She did not excuse what she had done. For the first time, she accepted that her title had never given her the right to ignore limits established for everyone. Anne listened without triumph. She stated clearly that the transfer would not be reversed, yet she promised Camilla would never be treated as an outsider during family gatherings. The Princess Royal had not taken the wing to defeat her. She had accepted it to protect a place where service had to matter more than possession. The contest between them ended there, not through affection, but through an honest boundary both could finally respect. Charles later met Edward alone and thanked him for acting when he could not. The king admitted that protecting someone from every consequence was not loyalty when the monarchy's integrity was at risk. His brother declined the praise, returned the stewardship documents to the secure cabinet, and stepped away from the authority he had used. He had not enlarged his position. He had restored order. No one had truly won. Camilla lost a privilege. Anne inherited a burden. Charles confronted the price of avoidance, while Edward sacrificed family comfort to preserve trust. Yet the crown emerged steadier because each of them finally understood the same hard truth. Duty could protect love, but privilege without limits would eventually destroy it. And so the Balmoral doors closed on one chapter without closing the family itself, leaving behind a monarchy chastened, reunited by hard truth, and reminded that the crown survives only when privilege yields to duty. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.